You need your ancestors, you need your Egbe, you need the Orisha, you need like all of these benevolent forces in your cadre of support, because what we're up against is really powerful and it's really dark. And there's no way that we just with our limited human capacities and limited human potential are going to be able to create the world that we want to see.
Welcome to Spirit and Liberation, the podcast where we bridge the sacred and the political, where ancestral wisdom meets the front lines of organized movement. Every episode, we bring you into conversation with spiritual practitioners, political organizers, and healers who are weaving ancestral wisdom into the work of liberation. We'll discuss everything from community-based care systems to the often unseen spiritual frameworks that accompany our movements. Whether you're a longtime student or initiate of African and Indigenous spiritual practices, or you're just starting to explore these paths, this space is for you. I'm your host, and my name is Jeanette Charles Marquez, and I'm an organizer, historian, and Ifa practitioner who is deeply committed to liberation. In this episode, we are honored to be in conversation with Leah Penniman. Leah is a Black Creole farmer, mother, a self-identified soil nerd, author, and food justice activist from Soulfire Farm in Grafton, New York. She co-founded Soulfire Farm in 2010 with the mission to end racism in the food system and reclaim our ancestral connection to land. Leah is also a practitioner of Ifa and Vodun, two African spiritual systems dating back over 2 decades, one with roots in Yoruba cosmology and the other with its roots in the Congo and today's Haiti. We'll hear how these traditions have deeply informed not just how Leah stewards the land, but also how she builds systems of care, justice, and liberation. Through Vodou, Leah draws on the power of spirit, ancestors, and the revolutionary legacy of Haiti, a legacy of liberation born from ceremony, spirit, and the refusal to submit to empire. Leah reminds us that the earth is an Orisha and living divine being in her own right, a sacred spirit with whom we must be in right relation. Leah speaks about the wisdom of the land, the power of intergenerational movement building, and the lessons she's learned. You'll hear about why it matters to ask permission before we change the earth's form and how rituals of offering, divination, and song have shaped the way Soulfire Farm moves in the world. Thank you so much, Leah, for joining me today. I'm curious if we can start with maybe what this experience of being in fellowship with so many organizers and practitioners, how it's defined and or expanded your understanding of liberation work, especially as it relates to Ifa and Orisha practice.
So I think prior to being part of Spirit and Liberation Fellowship, I had a sense that these spheres of life, the sphere around our Afro-Indigenous spiritual traditions and the sphere around social and ecological justice as being by and large separate with a few touch points of overlap, and that those touch points of overlap were of my own invention. So for example, at Soulfire Farm, we're predominantly a farmer training site. And so folks come from all across the country, from Black Indigenous communities, sometimes internationally, and they learn everything from seed to harvest about farming. And because I'm a practitioner of Orisha religion, there are ways that I would sort of sprinkle in, after we do chicken transition, there's a certain type of spiritual bath, or before we harvest, we'll make these offerings, or let's sing a song, before we eat the meal. And folks would be interested and kind of come over afterwards and whisper in my ear, like, I'd love to learn more. Who's your teacher? How do I get involved? But those worlds were by and large maybe pollinating each other, but not so integrated. And something that drew me to the fellowship in the first place, but also that was so empowering throughout it, was being surrounded by people who were working to integrate those practices and those ways of being more deeply, understanding that foundationally, the world that we hope to create is not about tinkering a society rooted in plunder and death economy, but a foundational shift in cosmology and worldview, this reclamation of Afro-Indigeneity as foundational for the world we want to create. And, there's my teacher, Awishe Agbaye Wande Abimbola, talks about this a lot, about these eons and ages of the world, moving from a world where the predominant energy was water to the world of wood, to the world of iron, and then this world of really plunder and greed that's dominated by Khan and Ogbe, but this like by-force, this energy of just force and extraction. And that the only way to come into the new world is to go back and catch up to ourselves and be able to restore this covenant. And that's a beautiful story, right? But it's an entirely different thing to be around folks who are trying to live into that story and really see ways that we root all of the change work that we do in a fundamentally different understanding of the way the world needs to work.
You mentioned a little bit about some of the practices that you're able to integrate into your own work at Soulfire. And so I'm curious if you can expand on that just a little bit more.
Yeah. So in terms of the practices that we have integrated at Soulfire and hope to be able to integrate more deeply. So we're a land-based project. We grow food. We take care of, 80 acres of land. We feed community. We host folks. And it's been really powerful to see the ways that being in a container of safety and cultural relevance on the land does so much foundational healing of collective trauma. And that the earth is this partner in composting the difficulty of our lineage into possibility. And so there's a way that this would happen a lot by accident in the early years. We'd have a group of young people on the farm and they'd end up taking off their shoes because they didn't want to get their sneakers dirty. And then these tough city teenage boys would have these profound experiences with their feet, bare feet on the earth of having messages from their ancestors or messages from spirit. And they'd break down crying and they'd talk about their hearts in these much more tender ways than they were originally willing to engage. And instead of allowing those to just be happy accidents, we've realized that the earth, who is an Orisha, who is Aye, is longing to have her contact with her children and longing to have us back and to hear the laughter of the youth and feel our hands like plunged into that soil. And so to encourage and to welcome that, not just as a site of learning about soil chemistry, but also this deeper healing that can happen. And so that means, yes, cultural practices on land, such as spiritual baths and making offerings, singing, drumming, dancing. Asking permission is a really big thing. We always cast ifa or do, some form of divination before we make changes to the land. And we notice that the more we do spiritual practice here, the more the land, and I don't think this is coincidence, but the more the land responds by supporting our work. I think that it's not an accident that this year was our best year of yields yet and our most harmonious year, because I think the spiritual energy that we've been pouring into this relationship with Earth is reciprocal. And there's a reason why thousands of people come here and often walk away feeling, fortified and ready for the struggle. Because it's real out there. Like we're in the belly of the beast. We're in empire. And so we need the whole crowded room of benevolent beings at our back. It's something we always talk about with folks who come through. It's like, you need your ancestors, you need your Egbe, you need the Orisha, you need like all of these benevolent forces in your cadre of support, because what we're up against is really powerful. It's really powerful and it's really dark. And there's no way that we just with our limited human capacities and limited human potential are going to be able to create the world that we want to see.
I think this really connects to a question I have for you about activation of our practices and how you see that building our movements and also building alignment toward the world that we do want to see.
Yeah. So while not directly related to African traditional religion, I think that there are some really important parallels to draw across Indigenous traditions. And this includes heritage Buddhist practices. This includes Turtle Island Native practices. And so I was just talking with a comrade and a friend, Kazuhaga, who has a new book coming out, Fierce Vulnerability, that really focuses on Indigenous worldviews as a root source for social change. And one of my favorite, I'm going to kind of paraphrase, but one of my favorite summaries that opens a chapter is this, if we're not trying to take the throne, we're trying to eliminate the thrones. Right? We're essentially not trying to replicate and just put a new supreme ruler at the top of a broken and exploitative system of death and plunder. It's like, we want to remake the whole situation. Like, it's not. So I think when we are talking about activating our practices, it invites us to think beyond tweaking a system that fundamentally is bent on our destruction and exploitation, right? It's super important that we remember that it only took about 500 years to create heteropatriarchy, capitalism, colonization, white supremacy, and that there are many, many thousands of years where there was a different program in effect. And I'm not making a regressive argument. I think the Sankofa principle is very much go back and study and learn to catch up to where your ancestors left off and then continue to innovate and build. It's a futuristic argument, but there can feel like there's this inevitability around the system that we're in when we're only working in that framework. Like when our highest aim is to get someone elected president or to enact a particular policy or demand a higher minimum wage. Like all of these changes are super, super important to alleviate suffering. They're harm reduction, but there's a limited imagination in them. And so activating our spiritual practices and our indigeneity is about a much bolder reimagining of endgame.
I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more into how even your own practice and the project that you're building is kind of an expansion of this imagination and this vision for what is possible.
I mean, I don't know if I could claim that we've got all that figured out by any means, but I will say when we imagine what is possible here at Soulfire, I really love the metaphor of the butterfly of social change. So in summary, for those who aren't familiar, if you envision the four wings of a butterfly, each wing represents a core strategy for social change. So there is resist, which is like standing up against empire, the strikes, the boycotts, the protests, direct action, right? There's reform, which are those examples that aforementioned, electoral work, public education, DEI work in organizations. There's builders creating alternative institutions that do their best to reflect the values that we wish to see. And then there's healers, because we all have a lot of collective trauma. So that's the art and the spirit work. And not that they're mutually exclusive, but the metaphor is helpful because we can often get stuck in a paradigm that one is better than the other, more important or more strategic, when actually the butterfly can't fly without all four. So we do situate ourselves mostly on the building wing, where as we're building the farm, and we also have a co-op, we do our best to embody the structures of a world that we want to see. So for example, we have land sharing and land back agreements with the Mohican Nation, because in the world we want to see, Native folks have sovereign rights to their homelands. We have an intergenerational community that is living together on this land and engaged in mutual aid, because the world that we want to see has these structures of mutual support that are decommodified and that are relational, right? We measurably improve the land every year in terms of organic matter and biodiversity, because the world that we want to see is not just sustainable at the current levels of destruction, but is working towards like a healing and restoration of a more whole ecological state. And so spirit is so integrated into this. I mentioned briefly this concept of asking permission, but that comes into play in a lot of these things. We'll do our annual divination. We're not going to do anything without Ifa saying. And sometimes we don't get an answer that we like. Like we wanted to dig out the pond, and it's like 2009, we kind of mucky area, and we wanted to put emergency water in. And for 9 years, Ifa said, no, you don't get to dig out this pond. It wasn't until the 10th year of building this relationship with the land that we were granted permission to do this major earthworks project on the lands. And I really do believe that if we had forged ahead and done it anyway in this human supremacy model that's so prevalent, the land wasn't going to give us all the things that she's giving us now, both in the material realm of all of the amazing food, and there's like very few biting insects. People aren't getting hurt. Like a lot of things are going well, but also the healing potential. It almost feels miraculous and magical. You're like, how are these 9-year-olds going to be coming to the farm and talking about this place is better than Six Flags? And I finally feel like I'm beautiful and like all these things. Like, it's just a farm. Like, it's just a farm in quotes. So that spiritual relationship with land and that engagement in that way, I think in turn, like feeds the human community. That's part of it.
Definitely. And I'm just sitting with like how Ifa is so connected to the land and Orisha tradition and also voodoo, which you practice, and so many of our African and indigenous lineages, and how they offer us this other way to understand our relationship to the earth. And yeah, and just like the power of like, well, what was this pond's purpose for those 10 years? And like, what did it actually serve? And what was important about its existence? And there are things that, we'll know and understand and things that we don't, that are occurring like on a spiritual and esoteric level of, the energy that water brings, right? So just such an interesting example. One of the things you mentioned that I really appreciated too was how intergenerational the work is at Soulfire. And I know during our time together in Puerto Rico and Brazil, we also got to experience and witness intergenerational organizing and also community around these traditions. And so I just would like for you to speak a little bit about kind of the role that plays in the work that you're doing.
I mean, that was something that was so inspiring, especially in the Contumblé house, the Tejeros in Brazil, was seeing the ways that, one, the matrilineality and femme leadership was incredible, but also the ways that the folks who were leaders of Spiritual House were also leaders of grassroots organizing, advocacy, base building, and social change. That was just super wonderful. And then constantly doing leadership development of the next generation, like sending folks on errand and training folks up. And so I think there's a lot of parallels. We're by no means anywhere near where they are there, but especially this framework of the marathon relay of the work, not the solitary sprint. I think it's something we're getting better at, but recognizing again that if it takes 500 years to build this system that we're in, it's not going to be fixed in my career or even my lifetime, right? And so there has to be a way that we're constantly building collective, like each one teach, one flow through, where the elders are sharing and imparting wisdom, and then there are folks on the ground getting stuff done, and people are developing leadership and sharing power and then passing to the next person. And, as mundane as it sounds, like one of the ways that it shows up that I think we're really honing in on at Soulfire is from the month 3 that someone is on the team, they're getting put into a leadership role. And then a year 2, like another leadership role. So sort of constantly building capacity and trying to spread capacity as widely as possible. I think also when we look at our governance structure, our board has always elders, sort of mid-career folks, and young people. And so the decision makers are going to reflect all of these perspectives. And you see folks like Dr. Claudia J. Ford, who's one of the elders on our board, always slow in our roll, always cool in our heads. Folks are like, no, we got to do this. And just all activated and do an extra. And she's just like, we're just going to slow down. We're going to integrate this lesson. This is the long game. These hot-headed 20-year-olds would just be forging ahead and probably create more work for themselves. And so it's so helpful, especially in the power structures that exist, that we have these perspectives certainly across age, but also, across the rural, urban perspective and class and life experience.
One of the things as well that I think was so salient during our time and that you're building connections to as well has to do with the kind of new systems that people are putting into place. And sometimes they're not totally new, but there's new context kind of emerging, and just kind of what your gleanings are from this. Because I feel like that we are in a time where it's so palpable that what we have is a society in the US, but also internationally in terms of empire and imperialism and capitalism and patriarchy, et cetera. There's so many systems that are very clearly not working for like global majorities. And what are some of the lessons that you took away about systems that are being built?
So There's an idea I'm toying around with that I was seeing in our group. It wasn't explicitly stated, but it was sort of emergent. So this question of whether you can transform large systems or whether you need to abandon them and relocalize and rebuild. So I don't know the answer to that, but a lot of what I was hearing in the fellowship, as far as what folks were building, were these alternative relocalized imaginings. And while not explicitly spiritual, an example of that in my worlds of Black food and farming is that, after literally generations of wrestling with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to get funding for Black farmers, being repeatedly denied and delayed, having lawsuits that were won but were too little too late, winning a major victory with the Inflation Reduction Act, only to be challenged in court with 12 lawsuits for reverse racism, and then having the bill rewritten to be race neutral, like all this. And that struggle continues. Again, it's one wing of the butterfly. But Black folks were just like, we're just going to create our own capitalization vehicles. So they created the Black Farmer Fund several years ago, created Pot Liquor Capital several years ago to create non-extractive grants and low interest loans, right, to finance. And so this is in the finance world, right? But in a similar way, really seeing folks grapple with like the local global paradigm of like, how much can we reform or engage or, transform these existing systems, and how much do we need to root down? I mean, something that really fascinated me when I think about organizing at scale and what's brewing was our whole conversation around Ashewele, which, I missed the day of. So I was looking at it a little bit after the fact, but something that I gleaned from the conversation was the potential of healing and liberating our stuck ancestors who died in some of the most traumatic ways and inviting them into the moral army behind us to help us do the work. It's like essentially like we're short-staffed because a lot of our ancestors are stuck and it's an HR problem. So we need like more folks. We need more folks at our back so we can do the really big, big work. And so I don't know what we're doing with that. I think there was a lot of excitement and momentum around it. But this idea that, all of the campaigns and base building that happened in the material world, yes, but also how are we mobilizing this ashe so that we can manifest more than maybe we're allowing ourselves to think is possible.
Yeah, for the Ashewele conversation, it was definitely a conversation that I feel like inspired a lot of people in thinking about what is our role in honoring our ancestors who have died in really traumatic experiences, whether that's the European slave trade or colonization and wars that have come from that, genocide, and the ways in which people especially in the Atlantic world have been trying to pay tribute to those ancestors as well, and how that needs to happen at scale. And when thinking about kind of these focal points globally where there is a lot of devastation or there is a lot of imperial intervention and there are these kind of mass projects that are meant to exterminate our peoples, it's like, what are the tools that we can tap into? And I think Ashewele definitely gave a lot of us language and a framework to think about what that could be. And I like how you said it's also like this almost spiritual HR piece where it's like, if you're in an organization and you need staff, it's like we also need these ancestors who have, tremendous energy that can help in many ways balance out what's happening right now, right? And so it's kind of similar to even thinking about how are we in harmony with nature? It's like, how are we in harmony with these ancestors?
Exactly.
And how are we in harmony with kind of these other forces that, again, there's like benevolent forces that we need to tap into and that we need to align with, and that only, so many of our human senses can actually tap into that, right? And so how do we kind of center these tools and practices in our bigger like political strategies, right? And obviously for a lot of us, it's like, yes, many of us are practitioners of these traditions and also organizers, but then we also have people in our ecosystems who are organizers and are not practitioners and maybe sometimes want to engage. And then there are other times where folks are not trying to look at those kinds of spiritual conditions, let's say it that way. And then on the other hand, we have our folks who are deeply spiritual and sometimes need that political push. And so, I think part of it too is there's this invitation to rethink how we do our work and rethink how we engage with what is possible and what's necessary too. Because if we as a species intends to continue on in many ways, like this is actually a very critical time for us.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much in what you said. And yeah, thinking about particularly folks who are organizers or politically activated, but maybe they're spiritual, but they don't situate themselves in a tradition. Maybe there's a little splash of New Age or astrology or this or that. Something that was a conversation we started during the fellowship that I'd be interested in building on is this idea of how do we include these movement siblings in the work without creating some washed out hodgepodge New Age thing or just something that's so quasi secular, because there is a rigor in the specificity, but also the specificity could be alienating. I'll bring this to a separate example and then I'll sort of bring it back. So I organized with a crew of meditators and Buddhist folks around the election, the Minding Our Democracy group. And as is often the case, I was brought into the group to help diversify the program. And so I was reaching out to various friends of mine who practice different lineages of Buddhism or indigenous spirituality that's not Buddhist, but is related to contemplative practice. And what was really fascinating is that in this white-dominated group, there was some unaware pushback about the specificity that my invited guests wanted to bring, because that's who they are. So speaking in their own languages, chanting the mantras in their own tradition. And so there was this real pushback of, well, can we secularize and homogenize the message so that it's palatable and nobody is alienated, in quotes, by it, which of course, like all the rage fire boiling up in my soul, because I'm just like, you can't invite Asian and brown and indigenous folks and then ask them to act white. Like that's not. So there's a way where, it's the seed of an idea, but I think there's something to not so much an interfaith slurry, but the salad bowl of like multi-faith representation in our spaces where our Muslim sistren and our Buddhist sistren and Christian and atheist and horoscopy, whatever, can like bring their piece in its fullness. And we also bring our piece in the fullness of what it is, like the non-watered down fullness of what it is, the parts that are allowable to be shared, essentially. And in that way, we're sort of aggregating some of our spiritual power. Like if you think of Wakaima, which I know you know, but for folks, in 1791, our Haitian ancestors got together in the forest of Wakaima to plot the revolution, led by Mambo Cecile Fatima, and they were like totally the underdogs. I mean, we're talking about like no firearms, like no army up against Napoleon's folks. And a lot of our ancestors will credit the ability to eventually win the Haitian Revolution in 1803/1804 to this ceremony where they called on their gods from all of their various traditions. And it wasn't like they made them into one god or they dumbed it down in any way. The Congolese brought their Congolese gods, the Yoruba, right, brought theirs, and Nago and Petro and Dahomey. And this spiritual force came up to witness this pledge of liberty or death and then to back them up, right? So what's our Wakaima? Like, what is our ability to bring forth what I think, like, I don't believe in a hierarchy of traditions. I think all of our indigenous traditions are badass and there's a lot of power in them. There are 84,000 doors to the truth, or 400 plus one Orisha, with an emphasis on the plus one of that principle of addition and expansion. And so what are the ways that we bring that together? I don't know, but this is like a question that tickles my heart a lot.
I think it's a really great invitation for folks who are thinking about this work seriously is how do we understand our role and our strategy within like a historical continuum? right? It's like we have examples of what our ancestors did to achieve liberation within their certain time and context and conditions. And so what are we working and strategizing around? And I think what's really evident too is that folks and our ancestors have examples where they've activated these technologies and these practices beyond the confines of their reality, right? So in Haiti, right, thinking about, like folks were not in a position to win necessarily, and they activated what they knew they could to galvanize their energetic forces and to bring many nations of Africans together. Like I know many Pan-Africanists who talk about the Haitian Revolution as like the episode of, very early Pan-Africanism, right? And so, and not that that's really talked about in all Pan-African circles, but when we think about what it took to bring people from different nations and different lineages and even different military warrior styles, like, we have to think about, in the social movement ecosystems that we're in, all the different organizations and communities that come from different understandings of reality and also come from different ancestral lineages and come from different practices. And yes, like what is the space or the container that we're building to make things happen in our favor, right? And it just brings me back to kind of like an earlier comment you mentioned. It's like we need all of the ancestors. We need all of our spiritual mates and our Egbe. We need all of our Orisha to really kind of be part of this like broader united front as we also build our strategic coalitions here on Earth, with each other. Yeah, it's such a good question.
Do you have an answer?
No, I don't have an answer, but I think I do. I always sit with, what it could look like. I think if our organizations were primed in a way, or our movement was primed in a way where these could be central conversations in the same way that we have assessments around material conditions. And I think there's a type of, I don't want to call it training per se, but I do think that there is, like you said, a rigor and a specificity that's very helpful. And so not all of our traditions understand conditions in the same way. And that doesn't mean that they're mutually exclusive either. They can all be true from their vantage point. And so how can we actually like unite those, and how do we create space for this in the same way that we create space for understanding like leftist ideology, which is also valid, right? And yeah, so again, no answer, but I do think like that is like a type of container setting that particularly with Spirit and Liberation, we were able to start to plant the seeds to that. And I think, wouldn't it be lovely and efficient and effective for our movements if we could like spread that even more so? And yeah, what are the skills or aptitudes our people need to actually be able to do that successfully, where it's not like one lineage or one practice is kind of ranked above the other as more efficient or more effective or more certain. I think that's where it gets tricky because, we're human and rampant with contradictions at all times. So.
Absolutely. Competition and envy and greed and delusion. I mean, what you're making me think about right now is a project that we've chimed in on with the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, where they're creating a political education toolkit to provide historical and cultural context for the moment that we're in, right? Because, we arrogant youth sometimes like think we're the first ones that were ever here and we're not building on anything. And yet here we are going round and round and round. We could be learning quite a lot from the past, but you're making me wonder if there's any module or any mention whatsoever about the spiritual preconditions that actually make a lot of sense just as part of a political education framework, practice or no practice, like to just understand what spiritual technologies have been engaged in the service of healing this broken world, whether that's, the ways that the Black church are sites of resistance in the civil rights movement, all the way back to Wakaima and beyond. I think it's an important part of literacy, because the thing that I can feel as we're talking is when we're saying like, oh, let's leave space for these conversations as much as we assess the material conditions, where it often lands culturally in groups is in this commercialized self-care industry, soft life thing. It can just go right off that cliff and like just lose all of its grit and teeth as actually a liberatory tool. And then it just becomes like, are we working or are we resting? Which is an important conversation, but it's not the same conversation. And I think because spirituality has been like commodified and repackaged as a sort of make it up, anything goes, feel your intuition thing, it's not necessarily serving collective liberation in the way that we're talking about. And I can't quite articulate that, but it's a very felt sense where I'm like, oh, if we try to do like a spiritual assessment in our org, that'd be a total shit show. That's not right. Like that's not what I'm talking about.
Everyone would be on a break.
They were like, yeah, I'm just going to go, home and feel myself. So it's there's some learning.
Yeah, that's I think the exciting piece to this is that there's this recognized reality of like we're not necessarily at this point collectively to be able to do these collective assessments in a way that's actually about like spiritual fortification and political rigor, spiritual rigor, like to do these traditions in a way that's going to transform our world for the better. Like it does require deep study and rigor and practice and a commitment to the collective in ways that our political movements also require, right? It's just kind of a different modality. So I'm definitely sitting with kind of this question of like, well, what's next and how do we build this? And I think for anyone who might be listening, they also should be sitting with this question because the near future is looking very challenging. And I think we are definitely in an era that is going to require many of us to consider how we want to show up and what is going to be our specific contribution to the work and to our liberation. So that's why I really appreciate just Spirit and Liberation overall, because it's definitely been framed in a way where it is possible for us to obtain the conditions that we want to see. It doesn't mean that they're easy or that we're always going to make the correct assessment. But if we're able to tap into these practices and these traditions and sit with our elders and sit with our young people and sit with our ancestors and sit with nature and really listen, so much is possible on the horizon. So yeah, I think that said, I just want to invite you if you have any kind of closing reflections or thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up.
The thing that I want to share that I haven't explicitly shared yet is around what I think is the necessity of tactile hands-on engagement with the earth as part of this liberatory praxis. Our Afro-Indigenous cosmologies were never heady or theoretical. They're always experiential. And we were evolved to be experiential. So I think we can only get so far with doing everything above the neck. Like there's something about the somatic engagement of our body, growing the herbs, growing the Ifa herbs that we need to use, and like mixing our omiyero on the land where we have a tree planted with our children, and going over to the shrine room that we built because we have some carpentry skills and we harvested some wood and we work with our friends, and cooking the meal, from what the land has given us and the offerings that we put down when we harvested. Like there's something actually about the intelligence of engaging in a corporeal sense, in this like tactile sense, that is part of that spiritual intelligence that can't be theorized. And so not to be overly like, I'm on the land, everyone come back to the land. But I do think as a predominantly landless people, and I'm talking about the Black diaspora, who's continuing to lose our land, that's something we need to be paying attention to as part of the liberatory framework, is like holding on to, and I don't mean individual fee simple private property. I mean like holding on to our community land spaces, to our co-ops and our land trusts and our heirs property, and making sure that there is a place where we can root down and do these practices, which are not out of a book or in our heads or in some type steel building. Like they can be adapted somewhat to that, but they're foundationally earth-based practices. And so they require us to be in touch with the earth, who we worship and who we see as divine and in relationship with. So yeah, everyone needs to touch the land. That's what I think.
Yes. And that's the very full circle. So definitely. And we could talk more about this, and perhaps we can in another moment. But there's, so much of what we saw in Puerto Rico and Brazil focused heavily on land and either having land or not having land. And there is so much to that, and thinking about the viability of our movements and our communities, and being able to build the world that we want is also being able to exist in and with nature, as part of nature, which we are. But many of us don't have the opportunity and or what's now become like a privilege to, when it shouldn't be, to have access to land. And so there is a big question, because obviously we're in the height of capitalism and imperialism, and a lot of it is about seizing, stealing, and occupying land. So, well, thank you, Leah. This was fantastic.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you including me. I look forward to hearing the podcast when they're put together.
Before we conclude today's episode, our special offering is a sacred Ifa story about the antelope. One day, the antelope decided to get Ifa consultation. When the Babalaos cast Ifa for the antelope, the Odu of Oyeku Odi was revealed. The Babalao, an Ifa priest, told the antelope that it was important that he call together all the members of his family and bring them to the Babalao's house. The antelope went and called the tiger, the leopard, the hyena, the buffalo, and other animals and brought them to the priest's house. When they settled, the Babalao told the animals that it was important that they offer a bow for the antelope so he would not die. If he dies, all of you will come to regret it. The animals then responded, well, this doesn't concern us because it's dealing with the life of the antelope. Why should we spend our money to keep the antelope alive? So they didn't make the offering for the antelope. One day, while the antelope was out and about, a hunter saw him and threw a club at him. The antelope died. When the hunter got home, he began to skin the antelope and noticed that the antelope's skin was very thick. He then got the idea to turn the skin into a bow. The bow came out to be very strong. He then began to fashion many arrows. He then went out hunting, and with his new bow, he killed the deer, the lion, giraffe, leopard, zebra, and other animals. When the animals realized that they were being taken out quickly, they went to the house of the Babalao and told him what was happening. The Babalao told the animals, we warned you that if you didn't offer the abo for the antelope, you would all come to regret it. So now you are all dying as a consequence for not following the advice. This Odu, Oyeku Odi, speaks to the heart of what Leah shared with us today. The importance of working together, caring for one another, honoring the land, and holding sacred our connection to all living things with reverence. Ifa reminds us that we must be fully invested in being in right relation, because inevitably we all experience these consequences together. These lessons, captured by the sacred Odu of Ifa, are teachings that guide and inspire us to build a better and more just world. Thank you again for joining us today on Spirit and Liberation, a podcast brought to you by the Latinx Therapist Action Network. And a special thank you to Leah Penniman for sharing with us strategies for how we can build a future of liberation rooted in land, spirit, and justice. If this episode spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone in your circle. Spirit and Liberation is hosted by Francisca Porchas Coronado and Jeanette Charles Marquez. Today's episode was produced and edited by Phil Circus.